Yep, it's yet another try at the same thing. So what we're going to do is we're going to talk about a couple different ways you can secure Azure resource. We're going to do this with EventHubs here. This is actually a walkthrough of example code that's sitting in this GitHub repo. If you run this, you will be configured as, and with the conversion that's sitting out there today, you'll be configured as I described. And basically the goal here is to figure out what kind of credentials we're going to use for different kinds of customers, clients, when trying to send and receive and manage individual event hubs or a namespace, right? So again, we're going to use this code base, and let me just walk through this. All right, so what we're going to do is the example code sets up two styles of credentials support. Let's talk about the ones at the top first. And remember, everything can be done at the namespace level or the individual event hub level. And for some of these, if you do access controls at the namespace level, it actually is inherited down through the individual event hubs. So in this case, we're going to set up, remember, there's two kinds of assignments we can do. One is we can set up an access policy, which basically says that anybody that signs a request using the secret will end up with whatever permissions are bound on this policy at the scope it comes in at, right? So if you use the shared secret to sign a request and you use the secret up here, you'll actually be able to manage this cluster. If you use the shared secret that was configured at the event hub level, the only thing you'll be able to do is send messages. So a lot of times for clients, this is what we'll do. We'll be like, man, you're just going to have a shared secret sign-in code, kind of like a cert, and we're going to sign our requests, and that way we know that you're allowed to publish to this. And there's some security concerns around that. It's super easy to use, but there's security concerns in another talk. So in this case, the sample code, and I will walk you through this in Azure. We have tokens for the individual event hubs, sign-in keys. So if you sign with any of these individual keys, data will be published to the hub. If you sign a request to get data from there, it'll be rejected. If you sign at the namespace level, if you sign using the namespace level key, you'll be able to manage the hubs, manage the namespace. So these are kind of one way of doing this, right? And again, it is an access policy on the event hub that gives this signing key permission. The other way to do this is you can use identities. And so an identity has a role assignment. And basically what you do is you take an identity, you assign a role to it, and you bind that to a resource type. So in this case here, I have a managed identity. It's an identity. And the only permissions, we're going to give it two permissions. We're going to give it receive and send. And we're going to bind those to the namespace. So if any Azure resource has this managed identity and they come and talk to this event hub, they will have read and write permission against all of the event hubs in here. We could have bound this 3 times to the individual event hubs in here, or we can bind it at the namespace level and give them permission across all the event hubs, right? So a lot of these are really tripart, right? There's the identity, then there's the role assignment, which basically an identity binds a role to a resource. And on the access policy, a signing request will bind a capability, a role, not a role really, but a capability to an individual event hub or to the namespace. So they're all tripart. All right, so let's walk through this. So here we have the example code sitting in Azure. It actually, when you create it, everything goes into a single resource group, and I do that because it makes it super easy to clean up. So the first thing we do, we have 2 things here, right? We have an identity we're going to bind to some things, and everything else will be done inside the namespace. If we look at the identity, we can look at the Azure role assignments, right? So we're looking from the identity to the bindings to the resource. Later on, we're going to look from the resource through the bindings back to the identity. So here we have this Azure role, this identity has 2 role assignments, and they are bound to the resource type of namespace. So this role has these permissions on this namespace and thus inherited inside the namespace itself against the individual event hubs or topics for people in the rest of the planet. Okay, so we can go back to the resource group here, right? So we looked at the identity binding. Now we're going to look at how the namespace is set up. And remember, there's 2 paths in the namespace we're going to do. One is we should be able to see that what role assignments for what identities were bound to the namespace. And we're also going to set up these shared access policies. So here we are sitting in the namespace, looking back at IAM, and we can see that the identity event, blah, 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 right? Identity, user managed assigned identity. That thing actually has the Azure EventHubs data, blah, 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 read against this resource. So before we looked at it from the identity point of view, now we're looking at it from the resource point of view, and we can see that there's a single identity that's got 2 role assignments pointed in at this namespace. Remember, the other kinds of access control we can do in a namespace is shared access policies. In this case, we created a shared access policy called send receive, and really it's manage. It should have been called manage. Anybody that presents a request signed with this key here that's blanked out will have manage permissions. So this is a shared access policy that provides manage for anybody that makes a signing request. The nice thing about this is you don't have to create a user for like some third party to send you this, right? It's a way of doing a binding, and the nice thing is if you delete this namespace, all this permission goes away. Whereas if you delete this namespace with IAM, those accounts still hang out there, right? In that case, you'd have to delete the account or delete the calling resource. So in this case here, we can see at the namespace level, anybody that gets a signed request with this key will have managed permissions. And you can see the endpoints down here and all that kind of stuff. Okay. Now, that was at the namespace level, right? We looked at the IAM access control, and we looked at shared access policies, 2 different ways to get permission. So now we can drill down into one of the event hubs, which really should have been called topics. I don't know what they're doing here. All right. If we look, right, we can look back again. So originally we looked at an identity that was bound through a role to the namespace. And then at the namespace level, we looked at assignments that were bound to it, and we found this managed identity that was bound to it. Because the topic, the event hub, is inside of the namespace, that assignment is actually inherited. So that identity, because it had read and write to the namespace, has read and write to the event hubs inside of it. And so here we are in one of the event hubs, data 1, right? We're in data 1 and we're looking back, and it turned out the Azure Managed Identity actually has any resource with that identity, Kubernetes, functions, whatever, that has that identity will be able to post messages to this to this event hub. So that's the IAM part, right? Where we're using managed identities, resource managed identities. And the other one was this signed request, right? And so here we created a shared access policy that says anybody using these keys, making a signing request with these keys, will be able to send messages. So if we had a non-Azure resource that needed to send, and I didn't want to create a service account, I could actually just give the requester this shared key. And when it made a request to this event hub, it wouldn't be allowed to listen to a message, but it would be allowed to post to this message, right? So if we go back to this here, did I do it right? Yep. All right. So that was this one here. The last one was this. On each event hub, I created a unique token that lets some process that makes sign requests post messages, events, to just this event hub. And we had created a namespace level one that lets us manage the namespace. The role assignment with the managed identity, any Azure resource, was bound to the namespace to do read and write. That meant any managed identity, any Azure resource had the ability to read from those resources with those identities, had the ability to read or write from any of the event hubs in this namespace. And that's it. So go back and look at this code, just run the deploy scripts. You'll have this stood up and you can play with it.